Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today we continue reading Raymond Geuss's Not Thinking Like a Liberal. And we are in the chapter 1, My Fate by Geuss, but we are moving on to a section called From Counter-Reformation to the Hungarian Uprising of 1956. And we're going to have to deal with a little bit of Geuss's biography, a little bit of the history of the Jesuits. A lot of stuff is coming up in this, and we're going to parse it. To explain this requires me to tell a historical story, or rather, two historical stories. First of all, during the Counter-Reformation in the 16th century, the Catholic Church mobilized to protect itself against the new reform tendencies in Christianity, which had recently come into existence in Northern Europe and were spreading. These were what we now call Protestantism. The church strove keenly to win back some of the ground it had lost to these movements in a number of different ways. One of the better known forms its reaction took was the formation of new religious orders, of which the Jesuits were probably the most effective and are certainly the best known. It is often pointed out that the founder of the Jesuit order was a former soldier, and that some forms of organization used resemble those of military formations. This is Varn speaking. As a side note, that's even true going back to the Benedictines. Monastic orders and the Christian tradition are actually explicitly kind of parallel to military orders, and sometimes just become the same thing, such as in the Templars or the Hospitallers. But that's not as useful because, for example, the monastic system that is developed in Buddhism has the same focus on ascesis, ascetics, but it is not similarly focused on a military-like structure. The discipline and the rule are not kind of spiritual military disciplines. But when the Jesuits are even more like a military discipline than most. Back to Geuss's book. The effective subordination of the individual Jesuit to the purposes of the order as a whole and to the strict discipline imposed on all members have been an inspiration to many later political groups, not the least of some on the political left. There was, however, another religious order that was founded at the same time, less well known than the Jesuits, but central to this particular story. It was the Order of the Pious Schools, Scholarium Perennium, and its members are devoted to teaching and especially to the education of the poor. The members of this order are called the Piarists. The history of the order is complex. It was banned and dissolved for some time, then reestablished, and eventually maintaining a particularly strong presence in the Habsburg lands, Spain, and Austria-Hungary. It also seems fair to mention that over the centuries, the original purpose of free education of the poor had in practice to make compatible with the financial requirements of running the schools, so the schools became fee-paying, and in some places, especially Hungary, they became rather training grounds of the political, cultural, and social elite, or at any rate of the Bildungsbürgertum. Nevertheless, the original commitment was never completely lost sight of, and the bursaries were always available for those who needed them. There were lots of pious schools in Hungary before the Second World War. In 1947, however, the Communist Party began to exercise control of the government of Hungary and accelerated, as part of the general project of secularizing education, a process of taking the order schools and excluding its members from teaching. This would have led very quickly to the extinction of the order because it would have lost its raison d'être. The Piarists fought a rearguard action against this, but eventually the outcome was not in doubt. Some of the priests moved to one or the other of the order's schools outside of Hungary. The closest ones were in Vienna or in Krems, Donau, Austria. In Moscow, in February 1956, Nikita Khrushchev gave his famous speech to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, attacking the cult of personality which had formed around Stalin. This had an effect in Hungary of seeming tacitly to express their willingness to tolerate reforms within the Communist Party, which duly began in the summer under Imre Nagy. But by the autumn of that year, the reforms have reached a point that caused Khrushchev and many other members of the Soviet Politburo to take fright. After a complicated political maneuvering, there was effectively a popular rebellion in Hungary and a violent suppression of it by the military forces in late October and early December. As a side note, for those of you who throw the word tanky around, this is where it comes from. It comes from people, Marxist-Leninists, some even Trotskyists, such as Sam Marcy, who supported the tanks being rolled into Budapest in response to the liberalizations initially allowed by Khrushchev after the secret speech. That's where the term comes from. Sometimes you'll hear Marxist-Leninists say that this uprising was led by fascists. There were fascistic elements in it, but there were also left-wing elements. There's all kinds of elements in the kind of uprising that resulted from the reforms. So this became kind of this with Prague Spring, and then later Perestroika and Tiananmen Square became kind of the fears of liberalizing social, reforming too fast in the Soviet Union, weakening the nomenclatura, etc. Thus, opening the Soviet forces, up to all kinds of internal failures. In the case of Hungary, it is my personal opinion that both sides are really of a mixed character. It's hard to support the Soviets cracking down on reforms that they instituted. It's also hard to say that everything going on in Hungary would have necessarily played out well for the left any more than solidarity played out well for the left in Poland. So we have to kind of deal with that. And also not to justify any of it. It's just to look at it from a kind of historical POV, not without bias. There's no way not to have bias, and I tend to be a mild Soviet defensist, but it's something that we have to deal with. Neither side of that movement was completely of a reactionary character, whatever we mean by that. Back to the book. During the last stages of the rebellion, 200,000 to 300,000 Hungarians left the country. About 30,000 have ended up in the United States. So many, in fact, in that final days of 1956, the Priorist founded a boarding school with a section for day students on a site of a former hospital for the mentally ill, located on nearly 20 acres of a semi-rural land just northwest of Philadelphia. About half of the staff of the school were Hungarian refugees, some of whom have come directly after the failure of the uprising, and some of whom have moved in earlier periods from Hungary to Vienna. Some of them, including my religion teacher, Bella Kriegler, have been imprisoned by the communist regime. Most of the other members of the staff were priests from the Spanish province of the order. The boys in the boarding school were of similar mix, mostly Hungarian refugees, but a sprinkling of Spanish-speaking boys from Latin America, whose fathers presumably had in their youth been educated by priests from the Spanish province. The fees at the school, although, as I later realized, were very modest indeed by the standards of private schools, were beyond my father and mother, a steel worker and a secretary, respectively. I do love that Geuss actually does come from a generation that with the working class and then through intellectual administrative core kind of emerged from it. So there's still a relationship in his generation between professors and a lot of working class people from families, like there is with my family and me. But by my time in the 90s, this was rare. And even though education had expanded dramatically, university education had expanded dramatically in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to who would go, but at the same token, as we've seen with fairly elite education, it's become increasingly rare from anybody to have that background. who goes into those fields. In fact, it's probably rarer now than it was in the 1930s, which is kind of messed up. All right. But the school made some arrangements with my parents so that I could attend. What I like about this is there's no intellectual content to liberalism, but what it does show is the way these two responses and one of the things you need to know about Geuss is he's actually dealing with both the communist and Catholic responses to liberalism as two kind of outside views that existed in the same place. And he's contrasting them and looking at their interrelationship. So setting up that his religious school actually has some direct tie to refugees who may be diehard anti-communist from Hungary, and the way that the Soviet Union responded to that is actually really interesting. I'm going to skip parts of his, he gives a lot of his family history here, and I don't want to read all the book for you. You should read it yourself, so I'm going to skip a couple of pages. A large part of my adolescence, therefore, took place at the intersection of a domain defined on one hand by the world of the steel mill, where my father worked for decades and I occasionally worked, mostly during the summer when I needed money, in a world of exiled Habsburg high culture in my boarding school. I use the term intersection metaphorically because any integration of the two domains that took place occurred in my head. The reason for this was that the school existed in a hermetically sealed bubble within a time warp. The city of Philadelphia was less than 100 kilometers away, but for all the contact the students in the boarding school had with the outside world, no newspapers, radio, or telephone were available, and there was only one payphone in the cloakroom on the ground floor. It might have well been just outside Debrecen or Szeged in 1932. I cannot pronounce Hungarian names. I am sorry. Buda and Pest is about the best we're going to get. Many years later, I read Erwin Goffman's book Asylums, in which he describes the structural similarities in organization and operation of prisons, mental hospitals, convents, military camps, boarding schools, and a number of other total institutions. I immediately recognize this type. As a person who's worked in both schools and prisons, yeah, totalizing institutions are designed in a kind of panopticon way. It's one of those things where as much as I tend to be distrustful of Foucauldian scholarship, Foucault does have a point. Being thus cut off from the outside world and subject to control, no matter how benevolent, of a group of adults with all the same mission, that of turning bullies into good Catholics, constituted a virtually ideal set of conditions for equipping me with certain skills, but also instilling me with certain attitudes, beliefs, and values. The relevance of all this to liberalism is that the Hungarians on the staff had lived through a deeply conservative, although perhaps not strictly speaking, fascist, it's pretty fascist, authoritarian dictatorship of Miklos Horthy in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and the German occupation of Hungary in 1944, the defeat and occupation by the Soviets, and then a decade of rule by a rigidly Stalinist, asterisk, for those of you who need other words, we'll say Marxist-Leninist, Communist Party. The boys in the boarding school knew only the last of these regimes. Whatever resistance any members of the order may have had to any of these political configurations were subsumed under their identity as Catholics and eventually as Catholic priests. The Spanish-speaking members of the staff had grown up in Franco's Spain. Where exactly in any of this was liberalism to be found, it is not really even on the map in that school. So when I speak about being predestined not to be a liberal, I mean essentially that the kind of education I received in secondary school was constructed for me passive thinking and reacting in attitudes which made it more difficult for me than it seems to be for other people to embrace certain basic liberal views. As a side note, me too. And at first, I was also kind of a reactionary. I did go to public school, and was not raised in a Catholic boarding school, and my religious background is varied. I was never particularly well religiously indoctrinated by anybody because Both my parents were of different confessions. And my family history had people of all different kinds of religions in it, even though we were mostly working class or a few failed aristocratic families who became farmers in the South that also produced us. So I had Catholics, both Roman and Byzantine, Eastern. I had Jews, and my father experimented with a bunch of religions. And so I had exposure to like Sinhalese Theravada Buddhism and Cambodian Theravada Buddhism and New Cambodian refugees. So not susceptible to that part of it, but that a lot of people in my life were doggedly skeptical of left liberalism, and even some of them skeptical of even right liberalism. Is pretty rare in America, where conservative Protestantism has a kind of split down the middle view. Half of it is liberal, and the other half of it is some kind of current reconstructed traditionalism, right? And so you had that, plus you had the racial politics of Georgia in the 1980s and 90s, which made me very predisposed to view left liberals as people who favored the upper middle class, who looked down on people like me, both from an ethnic and from a regional bias, who often talked a good game on racial politics, but never actually lived up to a good game on racial politics, etc. And so that kind of led me to be politically all over the place in my teens and early 20s, which often happens now too. And I think we're seeing another shift to the right from this attempt not to be liberal. I'm going to talk about the problems as we read Geuss here on mere anti-liberalism. But I think there's a real sense in which I was also geared up not to be a liberal, to be distrustful of liberal values, even the ones that now I think are actually helpful. Not just the economic problems with it, but also distrustful of secularization, thinking that secularization is of mixed character. I think a lot of things are of mixed character that most people see as unilaterally good. You could say that is dialectical, are complicated, but I think it's unassailably true. And the liberals that speak to me in the beginnings of the English liberal tradition are, not because I love the state. I'm actually deeply skeptical of the state as an institution. But the Hobbes versus Locke, I've always kind of felt more in line with Hobbes. There you're going to go. The weird Lockean liberal natural law thing just never, plus social contractarianism, just never made any sense to me. And the more I learned about Locke as a historical figure, I both saw him as a kind of progressive in the beginning, but immediately regressive in other ways, whereas Hobbes is a more complicated figure. Anyway. I accepted this fate originally because I was very unhappy at home. What did I have to lose? And also because, having a weak imagination but naturally a contrarian temperament, I was keen to learn Russian, which was the most thing I could imagine at the time in 1958. And the school offered instruction in Russian. I stayed because after initial culture shock, I found the environment congenial, or more exactly, better than things were at home. So I had been right about that, and the teaching was fully engaging. So can the education in a school in Pennsylvania in 1959 really have been that eccentric? And what exactly was this liberalism, which seems so out of the question for me? And I'm going to talk about that as well. So this part of the book is just interesting as set up because Geuss has a different background from me, but in many ways similar. I come from a similar hybrid background. I had access and I had gifts given to me particularly, in education and in very religious people in my life who were very helpful to me, but I've also been very critical of religion because sectarian division in my family divides it, as does race. I have Korean and Black extended family members. My cousins are half Korean, etc. So these things are live issues for me. And growing up in the South in the 1980s, when we still had a segregated prom court, is something that that really sits with me. And there's a lot of French and Irish and Scotch Irish Catholicism. My grandmother, on my mom's side, is Scotch Irish and Scottish in origins. Her parents, I came over from there, and her mother died when she was quite young. But she was a Catholic, even though her Scotch Irish parents were from Ulster, and the other part of the family was from the lowlands of Scotland, tied into and related to the Stuart clan. And then my maternal family was German, Bulgarian, Sephardic Jews, and married into another lowland Scottish family. That's my family heritage. Now, only Americans care about this. It's not like I'm any of those things. I'm a bloody mongrel from the southeast of the United States who identifies more as Jewish than anything else, for complicated reasons. But the long and short of the story is I was primed by that. I rejected the culture that I felt rejected me. And I have never felt comfortable around WASP, and I associated liberalism with secularized WASPism. Associated liberalism with New England Yankees and the Anglican turned Episcopal Church, and for lack of a better term, carpetbaggers. I associate it with people who didn't industrialize my area and who didn't do anything for the poor whites or black people around me, even though they talked a lot of shit about it. And so they're not prime me to like them. Once you understand that about me and how I came out of these circles and why I think the way I do, I don't have the kind of like, oh, I was a Democrat, then I became involved with Bernie, and then I became a Marxist that people a lot younger than me tend to have. I have the, I became interested in politics in 2000. I did not like the Clinton administration. I also did not like and kind of hated the Bush family. I didn't really trust Republicans who'd just taken over my state, but I had associated the Democrats with the conservative side of things because they were racial conservatives and they ran my state until the 2000s. And I think that the fact that like Georgia was a Dixiecratic state is something that is often lost on people. Well, that is part of the last century. It lasted till 2000. So Zell Miller was the governor when I was in high school. And so I bring all that up to help you parse where I came from, how I became a Marxist, why I'm not disposed to liberal thinking in the same way. And I often, despite what many people see me as I'm hostile to like the post left, whatever the fuck that is, and a lot of conservatives, because I come more from that world. a lot of people are responding to the liberalism. They come out of liberal areas. They grew up in North Portland, etc. That's not my world. I have I've lived in a few liberal cities, but I've either lived in most of my life in rural areas in the South or in the Maritime provinces in Canada for a very brief period of time, or I have lived outside of the United States. I mean, in Maritime provinces in Canada. And then later on started moving to cities that were more democratically run, although the cities that I lived in, Macon and Atlanta, before then were also run by Democrats, but in very particular ways, and where the divisions were really between Black Democrats and conservative Democrats, not really between progressives in the way that it was used even in the late 90s. If you add this to one of these things, when I was reading this Raymond Geuss book, I can see how I also followed a similar trajectory, ended up flirting with the Frankfurt School for a long while, became interested in Marxism despite a knee-jerk reaction against people like Althusser and the post-structuralist. Also got briefly involved with New Atheism to own my humanities major friends. My version of owning the libs in my mid-20s, particularly as I became less conservative. So reading this book and watching that struggle play out actually says a lot to me. Understanding the way these intersect will give you a good way to understand why liberalism is both dominant and what it actually is, and why it never caught on with some people. But why, like the conservative movement in America, for example, has largely been liberal. And on that note, I suggest you read this book. It tells you a lot about Raymond Geuss's biography, and you're going to get a little bit of my own too. Have a good night.